You are tuned to your friendly neighborhood radio station, KOOP, HD1, HD3 Hornsby, bringing you the In Touch interview show. This is Undercover Greg. As KOOP has been doing since last March, this show was pre-recorded and crafted in my home.
This world is one great battlefield with forces all arrayed. If in my heart I do not yield, I'll overcome someday. I'll overcome someday. I'll overcome someday. If in my heart I do not yield, I'll overcome someday.
Like the Civil War itself, slavery didn't end with one decisive act. After the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863. It declared all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states to be free. Northern abolitionists welcomed the proclamation as a first step, while Southern slave owners ignored it. Ending slavery would take a constitutional amendment passed in January 1865, Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox in April 1865, the heroism of many enslaved families, and the Union Army itself to personally deliver the news to the most remote corners of the conquered Confederacy.
The proclamation that Lincoln signed didn't find its way into Texas, which is where my father's family is from, and the Rambo family, until mid-June of 1865.
On June 19th, Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston and personally delivered the news.
The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor.
There was a lot of celebration, but there was also a lot of sadness, a lot of concern, a lot of fear. Both enslaved Africans and those who held slaves didn't know what really to do now. As freed Americans, where were we to go?
"150 years later, June 19th is a day of remembrance and celebration.
I think my first Juneteenth celebration was when I was 6 or 7, because I remember roasted ears of corn. And this was in Austin, Texas. And then coming here, I was surprised and really astounded to find out that Minneapolis, St. Paul have such a strong connection with Juneteenth. It stands to reason with the number of people who probably migrated this far north who brought with them that tradition.
Every year in Texas, Minnesota, and around the country, Juneteenth is marked with music, food, and fellowship.
We are celebrating at Mississippi Regional Park. There's all ages here. I just see all kinds of people and colors.
It's amazing to me that, especially among the African American culture, we have a little bit of a fear of embracing that history, because there's some shame connected to slavery. I don't feel that way. I feel that that is such an important part of who I am as a person. The strength that I have within me comes from that struggle.
African American Independence Day. Absolutely. We're celebrating. Yep. Our day of liberation, our day of liberation.
It's important to have opportunities for us to celebrate our oneness, our wholeness, our completeness, our dynamic selves. It's vital to African American people to have an opportunity, a date that heralds the importance of who we are as a people and what we've been through as a people.
Juneteenth gives African American communities a chance to reflect on their ancestors' struggles and achievements, and also to spotlight current issues.
There is a lot going on in this world. There's a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, and a lot of uneasiness. The foundation you have can kind of give you a little bit more of a sure footing, because you can look and say, well, wait, my family made it through this hatred. Somehow they made it through. Yeah, so take that strength and go up to the next level.
I love seeing the support that I get every year. It's always new people I'm meeting and hopefully collaborating with them so we could have Juneteenth and not let it die. It's so important.
If in my heart I do not yield, I'll overcome someday.
We open today's show with a wonderful piece produced by a group called Minnesota and the Civil War, and features a reading of Union General Garland's speech at Galveston on the very first Juneteenth. Our thanks to them for their efforts and for sharing a story that starts here in Texas, but has now gone national. For those of you who may have noticed, KOOP has had a glitch in our schedule over the last few weeks. The programming committee and playout team have been working extra hard to make it right. Lynn and I are helping today by accompanying you for the full hour from your passage to India to Lights Camera Austin with a second Juneteenth celebration event recognition. Today, Lynn speaks with Kenneth Witherspoon, otherwise known as Spoon, who has been a guest of mine on several shows and whom I now gratefully count as a friend. I first found Spoon when he organized and carried out the Sending the Slaves Home ceremony in nearby Georgetown. Lynn will be talking to Spoon about that in the second half hour of today's In Touch interview show. In the first half hour, we will hear about his past and how his education, curiosity, and talents raised him to become an activist and a force for positive change in our community. Throughout the hour, we will also hear music from Spoon's church, the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. We start with their Enter, Rejoice, and Come In.
Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Open your ears to the song. Open your ears to the song. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Open your hearts, everyone. Open your hearts, everyone. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Don't be afraid of some change. Don't be afraid of some change. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in.
We just heard Enter, Rejoice, and Come In, and turn now to the first part of Lynn's conversation with Kenneth Witherspoon.
All right, Spoon, here we go. Okay, KOOP listeners, this is Lynn Coles here with In Touch interviews. We've been airing on Wednesdays, now switched to Thursdays. We started doing these interviews with organizations and people in the Central Texas area who've been helping make sure that their communities are well networked and well resourced during the COVID-19 pandemic with respect to food security, physical health, financial resources, mental health resources, and so forth. And we're happy to be able to continue these conversations moving forward as vaccination rates increase in the U.S. and businesses open up and people can return to work and whatnot. We're really excited to celebrate Juneteenth this month by speaking with local Black leaders in the Central Texas area, celebrating the work that they do, talking about the conversations that they've had, not just during the pandemic, but more recently, and the stories and histories that have been really important to them in the past as well. So I am just so excited to be speaking with Kenneth Witherspoon, who goes by Spoon and who is a writer, has been a teacher, is a supporter of diverse communities and groups in the Central Texas area. He's a historian, he's a playwright, he's an archivist. The list just goes on and on. Spoon has worked for the Austin Area Urban League, for Big Brother, Big Sister, El Buen Samaritano, for the Region 13 Educational Service Center. And again, I could keep going, but instead I'm just going to stop and say hi. Spoon, thank you so much for joining us today and just lending your perspective and your voice to our program and to Co-op Radio.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I always appreciate the opportunity to speak with Co-op. So thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Let's start kind of casually. How are things going for you as we come up to the middle of June? You live in Georgetown, Texas, correct?
That's correct.
Right on. What have you been seeing in your life over the last few months? How's getting around Georgetown and just being a community member recently?
The COVID period has been interesting. I have Zoomed a lot.
Yeah.
And for some strange reason, there are times when I Zoom, I look at the Zoom screen and I swear I'm seeing Hollywood squares. But there's been actually a lot more communication because I think that people talk and it's better than the casual 3-minute conversation over coffee.
Yeah.
Just because you tend to spend a little bit more time. Well, what I knew, but I didn't really realize until Christmas was how much I missed people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really kind of cool now because my neighborhood is fully vaccinated.
Oh, good.
And it is so nice to just be able to go and talk to neighbors that for the past year, it's like been shouting through masks off the front steps.
Yeah.
Yeah, but to sit and stand and talk and be with each other. I had really missed that, and I had not realized how important a part of my life it was.
Right. And you mentioned those Hollywood squares. There was a report that came out on NPR maybe about a month or so ago that was following some research that a scientist had done about human psychological responses to Zoom and to all the interfacing platforms that we've been using over the past 15 or 16 months. And Zoom apparently instigates in human psyches a fight or flight response because it's like we're looking so close into our communication partners' faces that we are actually like up very close face to face with them, which of course is not how we interact in person. We usually give people at least 2 or 3 feet of space in conversation, but Zoom makes our brains think that we are up and close and impersonal with folks' faces. And it makes us think that we should fight or flee. As soon as I heard that, I was like, no wonder I'm so exhausted after all these conversations. My brain is trying to negotiate between these two very stressful responses the whole time we're on Zoom all day.
Yes, and because of my theater experience, I am so used to reading faces, but it's kind of bizarre to try to read like 12 faces at once.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I love that you just brought up the theater. I mentioned earlier that you're a playwright. Could you share with listeners a little bit about your background in the theater and some of the works that you've done there?
Let's see. I've been writing for a long time. I actually started writing plays when I was a student at Vassar College. As a matter of fact, at Vassar College, I auditioned for something in the theater department, although I wasn't in the theater department. And they liked it, but they said, this is reserved for people in the theater department. So what I did is I started my own theater company, which was called RATE, R-A-T-E, for the Ridiculously Ambitious Theater Ensemble. And I actually did 10 plays in 2 years. And finally, someone from the theater department said, you know what, why don't you at least take some courses? So that was cool. My playwriting teacher at Catholic University described me as a 20th century American playwright. He said that my plays tend to try to give a voice to the voiceless, whereas many other student plays tend to be about the angst of young student playwrights. I actually wrote about people and tried to get into souls and minds of people. I've been successful. I was produced in New York by the Negro Ensemble.
Awesome.
Last night at Ace High. And my plays range from a musical comedy, which I'm still working on, called Knocking Off Massa, a carefree comedy about the days of slavery.
Wow.
To Baby's Breath, a play about abortion, in which a daughter wishes to basically bring about not a fetus, but to get pregnant in order to transplant the fetal brain cells to save her mother from a fatal condition. And it's the battle between the scientist and a minister who come into the room. The entire play takes place in a living room which is being besieged by pro-choice people and anti-abortion people who are, of course, on the outside. They're never seen, but they're always heard.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of pressure there. I feel like the tension in that work is just pretty tangible.
Oh, yeah. And a priest at Catholic University gave me the ultimate compliment afterwards. He said, you tap dance across a floor of razor blades and you never broke skin.
Oh, wow. That's a heck of a compliment. That's awesome.
Yes.
Really?
Down here, I've worked with, when I worked at American Youth Works, I worked with a group called the Cultural Warriors, which was a student-run theater troupe in which the students did all of the work with the help of adult mentors from the theater community in Austin. I want to give a shout out to ACOT, because back then they were wonderful facilitators for my kids, to the point where we actually were invited to other schools and I made them do the booking. We had an attorney who helped them to write the contracts because I told them, you're going to do it all. I'm just going to sit back here and be proud of you.
Yeah. For listeners who are unfamiliar, ACOT is the Austin Circle of Theaters. It was at an adult theater group in Austin that Spoon had contracted to work with him for the American Youth Works Cultural Warriors. That's amazing for young people to take over writing, directing, box office, of course, acting, administration. There's so much material there for real experience in young people's educations.
Yes, and I have to, once again, I have to give a shout out to ACOT because there was no contract involved. I asked and they volunteered. They did this out of love of theater and eventually out of love for my kids. So
yeah,
this was all on them, their time, which I really, really do appreciate.
That's awesome. Do you remember any of the productions that the kids put on? Obviously, some of them were original. Were any of them works that we would recognize from other playwrights?
Probably, but that's only because they borrowed from them.
Gotcha. Okay. Awesome.
But what they did is they took examples out of their own lives. My favorite is there were the pigeons, in which I had the kids say, well, how do I act like a pigeon? I said, go out and look at pigeons. And they came back. And it was pigeons commenting on how much the humans were destroying the environment.
Oh, wow.
And very serious plays about drug abuse and what it led to, about pregnancy, about peer pressure, and ways that they could get over it using the play as a medium to give the lesson.
That's incredible. Give young people a chance to express themselves, and the products of those expressions are so poignant. Substance use, all kinds of issues that, maybe sometimes people are afraid to talk to, but you give a pen to a 15-year-old and that's the kind of hard-hitting stuff that they come up with.
Oh, yeah. And also some very good stuff. Going back when I worked in Baltimore, I worked for Center Stage. I was a playwright in schools. And the kids came up with some very, very good plays. My favorite to this day is there were tigers who were being hunted in Africa. So they stowed away on a ship. And they're all coming to America, and they're very happy because they heard that in America, food walks freely in the street.
That's fantastic. Well, your own work, you mentioned the comedy about the history of slavery that you're working on, and also about the work that you did on abortion. I'm curious to know, as a historian, how does your experience as a historian inform your work as a playwright?
Okay. As a historian, what happens is that you learn there's a story and you have to dig for it. And I try to do that in my works in terms of my characters. Dr. Stearman, who was my playwriting teacher at Vassar College, one of the first exercises he gave me, I turned into plays, of course, to qualify for the class, was write a 2-scene play. And the first scene had to be the most heinous character I could think of. So I wrote about a Klansman who had just finished lynching a black person. And I turned that in, and the second part of it, he says, okay, in the second scene, your job is to make the audience understand him without hating him.
Wow.
Which was the turning point for me, because it was, yes, that is really what it's all about. It's when I work with my kids, I used to tell them about the movies that they were watching, and I called them video game movies. And I had a bet with them, and I told them that in Terminator 1, I want you to go home over the weekend and take a look at it. And I will give $5 to anybody who can tell me the name of any single policeman who was in that station that Arnold Schwarzenegger destroyed. And they came back and they said they couldn't do it. One of the parents said that he was there and he was going back and forth on the video and back and forth. And they were all cop 1, cop 2, cop 3, cop 4. And I said, that's what you don't want to do in theater. You don't want to create stereotypes. What you want to create is archetypes. Yes, what you want to do is, I call it the Vitruvian theory. And that is that the things that we all feel, but sometimes we fail to think that other people are capable of feeling them.
Right. Which is just a project in empathy also, yeah?
Yes, yes.
Why do you call it the Vitruvian theory?
Have you ever read Vitruvius?
No, I just know the Vitruvian Man, the Da Vinci illustration.
Yes, okay. In terms of literary criticism, Vitruvius describes art as that which is sublime and that which touches the person who views the art or experiences the art in such a way that it reaches pieces of their soul and it creates literally a transformation, somewhat of an epiphany. When I explain it to my kids, I say it's Sunflowers by Van Gogh. I said, since the first time I saw that painting, I have never seen a sunflower the same way since.
Wow.
And that is what happened in music, in dance, in cinema, in theater, even in good literature.
Yeah.
You finish it and you go, wow, because something has changed in your own viewpoint of things.
Yeah. And when you started describing, you said it touches you, right? Like you really do feel something, like that empathetic connection is there between the art and the audience. Let's take this conversation in the other direction. As far as the notion of empathy, how does that inform your work as a historian? Or does it at all, rather? Is there some responsibility to feel historical characters or historical moments in a way that one feels an aesthetic moment that is created?
Well, it does. I'm a big believer in primary sources. But unfortunately, what I've found is that many historians choose to omit that which doesn't fit an agenda which they're really working on. They say that they're writing history, but it's history to prove a point. History doesn't really have a point. History is. My other friends who are historians say that we're really historiographers. That you have to take a look at everything. For instance, the Bastille. I tell my students I teach history to that, the Bastille is this great symbol in France of freeing the oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And probably the people who were actually in the Bastille when they stormed it all deserve to be there.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't fit the story that you want to tell. You see, history, you try to tell what happened, not to create a story. You can tell the story of what happened, but once you start omitting stuff, it's no longer history, and it becomes something else.
Right. I just got my mom a copy of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is just such an amazing work for historiographers who think about the extent to which historians were trying to create order in classical periods where, in most likelihood, there was no order there. It's just like it's a bunch of classical authors getting together and saying, this was the golden age, and they try to represent it as such.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yes, I blame Plato. But,
yeah,
okay.
We can all blame Plato.
You are listening to an hour-long special of In Touch interviews for Co-op's Juneteenth celebration event. We will be right back with part 2 of Lynn's conversation with local playwright and activist Spoon right after these brief announcements. To take us there, another piece from the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, Woyeya. You are tuned to your friendly neighborhood radio station, KOOP, HD1, HD3 Hornsby, bringing you the In Touch interview show. This is Undercover Greg. Welcome back to the second half of our 1-hour In Touch interview Juneteenth recognition show. We started off the second half where we left the first, with the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship's Woyeya. Today, Lynn has an extended conversation with local playwright and activist Kenneth Witherspoon. In the first half, we heard some of his background and education, while in the second half, Lynn explores his local activism, especially for those who cannot speak for themselves, the slaves of Williamson County. Let's return to that conversation now.
You've been a public figure in conversations about the history of slavery and especially its representations in the kind of north central Texas area, specifically your home in Georgetown. You did some work, correct me if I'm wrong, 5 or so years ago, making sure that there was at least an awareness of the slaves who were the enslaved people who were bought at locations in Georgetown, which might have been a historical moment that people were overlooking at the time. Was that 4 or 5 years ago?
Yes, that was. That would be the sending the slaves home ceremony.
Right.
That I did at Southwestern University.
Right. It was at Southwestern.
Yes.
Would you describe that event a little bit? What was its purpose?
You're from Virginia, right?
I am, yeah.
In Northern Virginia, the first time I saw these ceremonies was in the 70s during the big boom up in Northern Virginia, where it went from semi-rural to like an extension of Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And they would uncover graveyards of slaves or piles of slaves' bodies. And there were people who wanted to do a ceremony for it. And the developers were very actually kind about it. And they agreed that it could be done. There was just a simple ceremony in which if you had the names, and if you don't, you do it by characterization, because some of it was just these bodies that were found on the plantation of so-and-so. You sing them to heaven. You send them to heaven. What you do is you put their names on a piece of paper, and you burn them, and you sing the smoke up to heaven to send them home. That's it, yeah. It's not very elaborate, except the one at Southwestern was elaborate just because so many wonderful people assisted with it.
Wow. That's incredible work. That's so important to say those names out loud. Saying people's names out loud has been a strategy for people working in equal justice movements. This is recent memory. This has been an issue for a long time. Toni Morrison talks about the importance of saying her characters' names, right? And her characters very specifically have those kinds of specific identifiers that she gives to them so that they do have those identifiable characteristics. The ones that you mentioned, if somebody doesn't have a name or if you can't identify it, you at least use those characteristics to identify them.
Yes. Just to understand that they were real people, they lived, they suffered, they died, but they should never be forgotten.
Yeah. And that ceremony, again, was called Sending the Slaves Home?
Yes.
Yeah. That's so powerful, Spoon. And there's another issue with naming happening right now in Georgetown as well. An issue where stones are getting paved outside of the Williamson County Courthouse with certain names on them. I wonder, would you help me explain this issue right now with listeners?
You're asking me to explain the unexplainable, but I'll give it an attempt.
Well, thank you.
I became aware of this through a group called Courageous Conversations, which I'm a supporter of. And they have a Facebook page, and people started posting the pavers, which were the names of Confederate soldiers. There was one paver which says something like the war between the states with the dates.
Yeah.
And they were very upset. And it was discovered that it was a fundraiser that nobody really knew about by the Williamson County Historical Association. And people were asking how to respond, and someone said, well, we should put the name of slaves. And they asked if I could help. And I said, yes, just because of the Sending the Slaves Home ceremony. I know the databases to go to in which the names were there.
Mm-hmm.
And they started purchasing pavers of their own.
Mm-hmm.
And the fundraiser has been stopped. There are things going on in the city. There's an article in the Austin American Statesman this past Saturday in which nobody knows who did what and what was done or how it was done. And the last I heard, the City Council of Georgetown was actually going to look into it to see what it was all about.
Right.
Now, there have been reactions to that also, and some people want to remove the pavers. Some people, because the sending the slaves home ceremony started because I worked with the group, and all we wanted was, because there were people who wanted to move the statue. Mm-hmm. And what we wanted was just a sign acknowledging the slaves in Williamson County. Mm-hmm. And that did not work, which is why I moved on to the sending the slaves home ceremony. That is playing itself out as that issue has been since I've been in Georgetown. My personal feeling is that what I would like to see done is I would like the number of pavers dedicated to the Confederacy, which have already been placed. Mm-hmm. I would like an equal number on another corner of the square, which lists the names of the slaves in Williamson County. Mm-hmm. Okay, I also want it for the same price that the pavers for the Confederates were, since I'm on public radio. Yeah, I know what the price was. Okay, don't try to jack us up.
Right.
I want the same number, and I want the same price. I would like to put those there because for me, I just want an acknowledgement. See, there is no acknowledgement on the square of the slaves. There's a plaque on the door which calls them pioneers, African-American pioneers. Mm-hmm. But they weren't. They were property. They were slaves. And I would like that acknowledged because nowhere else on the square is slavery, not only the history of slavery, but nowhere else on the square is slavery itself acknowledged.
Right.
I think that it should be.
Yeah. And just for listeners who maybe are unfamiliar with the term paver, these are like memorial bricks that people can purchase and lay outside the grounds of the Williamson County Courthouse as it's being constructed. And the issue is that some people bought these bricks and they would honor the names of former Confederate soldiers on those bricks, or as Spoon just mentioned, they would just say the war between the states and list the years of the Civil War. So without even using, again, the historical terms that we're now using for the Civil War. And then one more thing. The statue that Spoon is talking about here is a 21-foot statue of a Confederate soldier that was constructed in 1916, so very much during the Jim Crow era, that still stands outside the steps of the Williamson County Courthouse now. It is still there. Is that right, Spoon?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
It's still there with Confederate soldiers that stand next to it in full regalia on various days.
And this is a conversation wherein people have lots of perspectives on how to deal with these historical objects with respect to the time period during which they were constructed, with respect to the extent to which they celebrate racism versus a paver or a memorial brick that would commemorate a civil rights hero, or a statue that would, for that issue, commemorate a civil rights hero. It's a complex issue that you've found yourself in many times, and I think it's because you're such a thoughtful and creative community member, and an active one, too. These kinds of debates will continue to find you as an archivist and a historian who knows so much about the history of these groups of people who have found themselves in conflict with one another over the course of the years.
Oh, yes. 'Tis a burden.
'Tis a burden. You mentioned that you had a statement about this issue earlier. Have you already made that statement, or was there something formal that you wanted to say?
No, it's just the pavers for the slaves. I would just like Williamson County to acknowledge that slavery, yes, did exist in Williamson County. And I would actually like them in some way to acknowledge that Williamson County voted against entering the Civil War, which seems not to be mentioned. Despite what ultimately happened, when the vote was put up to the people of Williamson County, they decided that they did not want to join the conflict. They did not want to fight in the Civil War. So,
wow, what was the reason there? They did not want to fight for the Confederate South.
I think that may have been part of it, but I think also there are other issues that come in once again. There were people, at that point, the Anglos in Texas were fighting everybody. So,
yeah,
they were fighting the Indians, they were fighting the Mexicans. So they felt that was not a conflict that they really wanted to be a part of.
Yeah. Oh, wow. It is actually a burden, the work and the perspectives that you are representing in Georgetown, the fact that you're organizing and inspiring these ceremonies and these, specifically the Sending the Slaves Home ceremony, and also advocating for equal representation for the African American or Black community members who right now are not equally represented in that public space. It's not an easy position always to espouse. I celebrate your work. I'm inspired by your work. And I want to also make sure that we have an opportunity here to talk about some work that inspires you. Before you and I started speaking here, you mentioned a program that you maybe help organize or maybe were just aware of, being a member of the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in Georgetown. I understand that there was some work that the fellowship was doing during the freeze that happened back in February due to the winter storm Uri. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that work happened and what it was about it that was inspiring to you?
Okay, that would be a little free food pantry.
Mm-hmm.
Sunday school classes, because we talk a lot about being a part of the community and things that we can do for the community, had built a little free library. And the kids, when COVID started, decided that they wanted to change that to a little free food pantry.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was, oh, cool.
Right.
The members of the church just responded magnificently. And we kept it replenished with donations of food and money to buy food.
Mm-hmm.
And also it expanded, once again, as a congregation, we talked about it. And other items were available just because of the nature of the way that the people who were in need were suffering. And that included diapers, feminine hygiene products,
mm-hmm.
things that cost money that people didn't have. Now, what happened in February, which really, really inspired me, was that for a 4-day period in Georgetown, we were the only food pantry open in the neighborhood. Because of weather conditions, the rest were closed. And people kept coming, and the church kept the pantry full. And from that, Jaquita Wilson was working with other community members in Georgetown, and they created something called the Central Texas Together.
Mm-hmm.
And the church provided storage space and things like that. But they expanded it to a 3-county area. Williamson County, I want to say Bastrop, and I forget what the third one was.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did is they took the food to those that weren't able to come get it. They identified those people. And they actually got a citation from James Talarico for the work.
Who's James Talarico?
Talarico. He's our representative from Williamson County.
Oh,
with
awesome.
the state legislature. Yes.
Gotcha.
And that was just the things that happen when people choose to do good things.
Yeah.
So, yes, that was during the coldest times. It was really kind of cool to know that even with the lights out and at some point electricity was out, to know that San Gabriel was making certain that they could do what they could do in order to make certain that people's needs were being taken care of.
Yeah. And that kind of organic community response from groups who just found themselves positioned, or even people, like folks whose whole friend groups didn't have power, ended up taking in 15, 16 people. Folks sleeping in sleeping bags or on couches or even in garages where people just had access to a little bit of warmth. The winter storm really brought that out in people. I'm getting chills right now just thinking about it. And the work that Central Texas Together made possible for their neighbors and community members. What an excellent organization. Do you know, are they fundraising or do they have all the resources they need from the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship?
Okay, so you're going to ask me to tell people where to send money.
Oh.
You really don't want me to go out of the house, do you?
No, we want you out of the house. I can also contact one of their organizers and see like what their needs are. We'll go with that.
Is that, and I want to say that our church wrote a grant to the UUA Assembly, the National Assembly.
Okay.
We had $500 for the Little Free Food Pantry.
Uh-huh.
And we were able to give them a $1,500 cash donation.
Oh, awesome.
From the National UUA. So.
Gotcha. Well, Spoon, we're coming up on 40 minutes here. Let's say goodbye for now and plan on catching up, I don't know, in a couple months or so. Does that sound okay?
That sounds good.
You are tuned to Co-op's In Touch interview show with Lynn Cole. We just heard the second half of her conversation with Kenneth Witherspoon, Spoon. We also heard one last piece of music from the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, Gather the Spirit. Our thanks go out to them for their music and other contributions to our community over the last most difficult year.